Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just a second, or just now at 2:30. We'll give people just a second to get in. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everyone. I'm Natalie Fritz. I'm on Region 7 representative for the Ohio Local History Alliance, and I want to welcome you to Beyond Maps, how to bring emotional, disturbing, and poignant primary sources into the classroom. We'll be hearing from, you can go to the next slide, just some logistics for this session. Everybody has their cameras off and is muted, but if you have any questions throughout, you can use the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen for asking any questions, and we'll moderate those and try and get those answered live. And then you can also use the chat for talking amongst yourselves, sharing any relevant links or things like that, but try and keep your questions to the Q&A portion. Today, we're going to be hearing from Traci Manning. Traci is the Curator of Education at the Mahoning Valley Historical Society in Youngstown. Traci holds a BA in Religion and Civil War Era Studies from Gettysburg College, an MA in Applied History from Shippensburg University, and studied Secondary Social Studies education at Wilson College. She spent 6 years working for the National Park Service in various parks, including Gettysburg National Military Park, Vicksburg National Military Park, and Harpers Ferry National Historical Park as an education park ranger before coming to MVHS in 2012. She has taught hundreds of thousands of students through a wide variety of outreach education programs, from pre-K students through lifelong adult learners. She is an active public speaker and a passionate advocate for history education. So I'll let you take it away, Traci.
All right, thank you. So I'm very happy to be here. Hopefully we are not going to have too many technical difficulties today, but I'll kind of give you guys a little bit of a warning. I'm a very casual presenter, so if you have any questions or anything, I'm going to try to get through those in this presentation. And hopefully we're going to try to have some fun with what can be kind of a deep and difficult topic. So I'm going to get my screen all shared up here. There we go. So I'm going to start with probably my favorite quote in all of history, which is attributed to Socrates, and its wisdom begins in wonder. And to me, that's kind of the basis of this presentation and why we want to bring primary sources into the classroom, especially those types of primary sources that are maybe a little bit disturbing or poignant or are really going to elicit an emotional response. So this quote, wisdom begins in wonder. And I think that's kind of where we all begin. We are curious. We want to know what is going on in the world. And when we get that little spark of wonder, a lot of us just dig. And most of us are going to be historians and educators in this presentation. And I think that's kind of in our nature to dig and to be curious. So that's what we're going to do today. We are going to explore some of the ways that we can take some deep primary sources into the classroom, really leverage our collections, and hopefully inspire some students to create their own wisdom and really start to think about history. So hopefully we all know the differences between primary and secondary sources, but just in case you don't, primary sources are of course the contemporary ones. They could be photographs, letters or correspondence, autobiographies, those types of things. Secondary sources, of course, are your textbooks. They could be biographies written 100 years later. And the great thing about the world we live in right now is that accessing great primary sources is getting very easy with the internet. And especially right now with this COVID pandemic, we're seeing a lot of museums and historical societies and archives focusing on putting collections online, which I think is fabulous. So we have great opportunities to find some really wonderful primary sources. So if I'm randomly looking down, it's because my notes are over here. So something that you might not know if you're not pretty regularly in the classroom with students is that by second grade, they're already starting to learn the differences between the two. And then by third grade, it's written right into their Ohio curriculum standards to start to study the differences between primary and secondary sources and how historians use those to learn about life in the past. So when we think about primary sources, especially those deep ones, think about the world we live in right now. We are surrounded by primary sources all the time that are documenting this world that we live in, whether it's our social media accounts, whether it's 24-hour news cycles, newspapers, magazines, whatever it is. And think about how many of those are positive all the time. Not many, especially not right now. So students are living in that world. Students know what happens in the real world. So I want to kind of show you just a few things that are really in their lives as students. So if you're not familiar with this program, this is a program called CNN 10. And a lot of middle and high school teachers will use this as a 10-minute news program almost every day. And it takes the news that's happening in the world, condenses it into 10 minutes for a student audience. And you can see some of the screenshots of what these students are seeing, whether they're protests in Iran or Iraq or Venezuela, if it's a plane crash, whatever it is. These are things that students are seeing. So not just in their classroom, they're seeing these types of things out in the world. So I have some newspaper headlines here from some different protests and demonstrations, from the horrific shooting that happened in El Paso, Texas. And then one that really gets students where they're at is school shootings. This is something that they're facing, not just on a high school level, but every grade level of student is dealing with this real world reality of school shootings. So I have headlines here from the Parkland shooting that happened in Florida. And then the last couple of pictures I'm going to show you here, this is what students are doing in their classrooms and in their schools, these active shooter drills. And I've been there for active shooter drills that we didn't know were coming, and it's terrifying. There are some students who even get picked to be involved as kind of actors in these programs and drills. And if students can handle this, if this is the world they're living in 24/7, they're gonna handle whatever primary source we put in their hands. It's up to us to figure out what's appropriate and how we're gonna bring those primary sources to them in a way that will help them learn. So these are the questions we're going to try to answer today. So we know that history isn't pretty, but the world we live in today is not pretty either. So how are we going to bring these distressing stories from history into the classroom? How do we expand on those basic stories to dive deeper? How are we going to help students understand the complexity of history and uncover that complexity? And then how can we guide students towards discussion and critical thinking and get past what I think is one of the worst things in education today, which is this the right answer? Or do I put this here? I mean, if you've taught students today with outreach programs, you know that's what you hear more than anything else is that the right answer? Or is this where I write that down? Because they're so used to just repeating information on a test and not really thinking. But that's what we want to do. We want to spark that wisdom by creating that wonder in these students. So let's see how we do that. So the first thing you're going to want to do is figure out what your story is. So this could be a broad story. It could be, if you have a historic house museum, maybe it's the family that lived there. If you have a historic site, maybe it's the event or the people that are really integrated into your history. Or if you have a very broad historical society or museum, you could have thousands of stories that you can tell. So trying to figure out what your story is the most important first step, because that's going to lead us to the biggest question in this entire process is how does this primary source advance my story? So if the primary source I'm going to use doesn't move my story forward, it's not worth using. So we want to make sure whatever we're picking moves that story forward. And then the next thing we want to think about is knowing that story a mile deep, but realizing you're probably only going to ever teach an inch of it. But students are going to ask you amazing questions. So even though you're probably only going to ever teach 1 inch of that story, we want to have a mile depth of knowledge underneath that so that we are ready for any type of question that could be coming our way. And students are kind of amazing and how they come up with these questions. Even after teaching some of these programs hundreds of times, I still get kind of blindsided by a question. And I'm so thankful that I've prepared and I have that depth of knowledge underneath so I can help find an answer and help continue that student on their journey of wondering. So kind of be prepared for that, and definitely be prepared for the fact that you might want to teach that entire mile, but that's like a full semester in graduate school trying to teach something like that. So just be prepared, know what your most important aspects are, and then kind of let the students help guide you. So this next slide might be a little controversial, but that's the whole point. So I want you to think beyond. Think beyond some of those kind of basic stories. So how many of us that do this type of outreach education, whether it's field trips or classroom visits, how many of us have like a pioneer story program or like an old school day program? We do, and I love it. They're great. And that's really soft history. It's wonderful. We learn a lot. We can do some great comparisons between past and present, but let's kind of get away from that soft history for a little while. And then how many of us just kind of talk about the most common topic, which are old, dead, rich, white guys? Their voices are certainly important, but what other voices do we need to hear? What are the other stories we can tell with some of these primary sources? Whose voices are missing? And in finding those missing voices, we might really help a student connect with the past. So that's going to be one of our main goals here. So to get a little technical education at you, I'm going to share some screenshots here of the Ohio curriculum standards, just to show you where these are fitting in, where students are at. So by 3rd grade, you can see right on their content statement with a history strand, primary and secondary sources can be used to show change over time. So in 3rd grade, we're doing a lot of past and present comparisons. And great primary sources for that could be artifacts, they could be maps. I do love maps, don't get me wrong, I love maps, but I kind of want to help us move beyond those. They could be letters or photographs, anything like that that can show the changes between past and present. Now by 4th grade, we're using primary and secondary sources to create historical narratives. And in the heritage content statements, you can see that we're getting very specific with the types of history that we're learning. So we're going back thousands of years ago with our indigenous history and then coming right up through the Underground Railroad and into the early years of the Industrial Revolution. So we've got several thousand years that we get to pick from in 4th grade. So 4th grade is actually where I start to introduce some really strong pieces of hard history, especially when it comes to the Underground Railroad and the anti-slavery movement. And I'll tell you why as we kind of keep going a little bit more. But I want to share just a few more state standards with you. By grade 8, we're diving even deeper into primary sources. We want to examine events from multiple perspectives so that students can present and defend a position. So 8th grade, I mean, they're just opening the doors for historians to come in and do what we do with these 8th grade students. And then by high school, I've got a few slides here just to show you kind of the depth that we're able to go to in high school classes. So we are looking at various time periods here, kind of in the modern industrial era, but still using primary sources to do that. Keep kind of moving forward here into the later parts of the 20th century, how we can incorporate primary sources into these topics. And then the last one here, these content statements, again, you can see the use of primary and secondary sources of information, which includes an examination of the credibility of each source. So by the time these students are high schoolers, that's what their content standard is asking for, is being able to examine the credibility of sources and then use that to develop support for positions. So this is what we do as historians, and we're asking our students to do this. So we have a great opportunity to get in there and work with these students. All right, so now that I've put all of those at you, I want to talk a little bit, I'm flipping through my notes over here. I want to talk a little bit about where your story is going to fit in. So the number one thing you're going to think about is that the content standards will drive the development of your curriculum. So knowing what story you have, taking it to those curriculum standards, and then that's going to tell you where it's going to fit in. But now, is it appropriate? So these are the questions that I think a lot of people will come up to me with when I talk about these types of primary sources. So I have 6 words on the screen, and these are the words that I'm constantly thinking about when creating a program based in this type of source. So it's balance, truth, honesty, empathy, understanding, and listening. So to me, these 6 words are what I need to do when I'm looking at these primary sources and answer that question. Is it balanced? Is it true? Is it honest? Is it going to be empathetic? And then will it help students understand? And will it help students kind of listen to the primary source? Because that source is going to speak to them. And like I said before, the main question we want to ask is this source moving my story forward? And in a while, we're going to talk about shock value because there are primary sources that do that. They are specifically there for shock value, to make a student sit back and kind of be shocked for a minute. And those have their place, but they also have to move your story forward. We never want to put something in front of someone that is just there for shock value, because it's kind of a waste of time. Anything that's going to move our story forward and have shock value is great, but it's the moving stories, the story forward, that matters the most. So the bottom of the screen there, you can see the difficult stuff is difficult for a reason, and that's why it's even more important. So now, as we think about age-appropriate materials here, start to think about when students learn the differences between right and wrong. Now, we could spend days talking about ethics and morals and those types of things, but I think for the most part, as students are starting to hit 2nd and 3rd grade and 4th grade, they have an idea of the sense of right and wrong. And whether it's, someone's philosophy is right or their actions were right, they still kind of have that idea. So once students realize the differences between right and wrong, they can start to see that in the past. And they can start to see how maybe things weren't fair, or maybe things weren't done nicely to someone else. And that might be how a young student looks at something, whereas an older student might look at it deeper. And they might say, ethically, this was one way, or here's the reason why something like this happened. So students are going to be able to kind of digest these materials probably a lot earlier than you think. We also have to keep in mind that there are going to be adult concepts that we don't want to bring into the classroom, whether it's a type of assault, a sexual abuse, something like that. You know, those things happen in history and they matter and they're important, but how can we talk about that in the classroom in an appropriate way? Well, the best way to do that is to let the student lead that questioning. So if a student is coming to you with a question about a primary source, they're already coming from some base of knowledge to have the kind of courage and the ability to ask that question. So let them guide the depth to which you're going to crawl to and dig to as we dive into these sources. So if you think that the material is appropriate, if the teacher agrees with you, you're probably fine. If it's an adult topic that is definitely, if a movie about it was going to be PG-13 or R-rated, maybe you don't take it into an elementary school. If a topic is going to be kind of PG-13, you know, maybe that is okay for a high school class. And we're going to talk about some tips and tricks to how to keep everybody respectful when we're looking at these primary sources. So I want to talk about some actual primary sources that do this. So these are some of the sources that I use in an Underground Railroad program that we teach. And this particular primary source is what sparked my inspiration to lead this program. And what you're looking at here is a slave auction list. So we use this when we are looking at the depth of the pain and suffering that came with slavery. So the slave auction list, going from left to right here, you have how many were sold in the lot number, their names, any particular description of them as a person, and then a few of them on this particular copy have the price that they were sold for penciled in. So I want you to note number 15. Her name's Eve, and there's a word next to her in her description, and that word is prolap. And it's a shortened version of prolapsed. And I had a student come to me when she was looking through this, and she just flat out asked me, what's that word mean? And I said, well, prolapse is a medical physical condition that most likely means the woman could no longer have children. And so she kind of sat back, okay. And then she said, well, why does that matter? Why would they want to know that? And I said, well, you know, she's only 25. I'm going to scroll to the next slide here where you can see some of their ages. So Eve's over here. She's 25, sorry, right here. And at 25-year-old woman, they might want to know if she was able or not able to have children. And the student asked, well, why is that important? And I said, well, what do you think? You know, why would a potential new owner want to know this? And it took her a second, but she said, oh, she couldn't have any more babies, so there wouldn't be any new slaves. And I was like, there you go. That's it. So these are the types of things, that one word sparked that. Well, then another student said, well, how would that happen? You know, did she already have children? And I said, yeah, she could have. And that kind of sparked from the fact that she's being sold with a woman named Eliza, and Eliza's 8 years old. So we don't know if Eliza is Eve's daughter or a sister, or they're just being sold together. But the student kind of said, well, how would that happen? And I said, it's a good chance that it came through some type of abuse, whether it was an attack or whether she had just had so many children before that she wasn't able to anymore. So I let the students start the dive. So I kind of followed their questioning and I let them see how far we were going to dig. And you do about 1 million things in your mind when you get these types of questions. But the best thing you can do is let the student guide the way. So if they're confident and courageous enough to ask these questions, we really need to answer them, because I think all too often students get the happy answers And we're not doing them any good services by giving them the happy answers in history. The first time a student learns anything about the past, they need to learn the truth. We can't, sugarcoat history in first and second and third grade. And then by the time they're in high school, they learn the truth and they're like, but wait a minute, I thought, everything was great in the past. So we've got to make sure we're giving these students the truth from the start. So I want to share with you a few more of this type of primary source and what they can do in the classroom. So here, this is one that does get used quite often when studying the history of slavery. This is a raffle poster. This is from the 1840s. And I like this one because I'll tell students, just read the big words. You don't have to read the little words yet. So by doing that, it's a raffle for a dark bay horse named Star, a mulatto girl named Sarah. They'll be raffled for $1 each. So students they sit back and they think, oh, it's a raffle. Okay, it's $1. Even in 1840s money, $1 is not too bad. And then I'll tell them, well, think about what this means. It's a horse being raffled. Okay, maybe that's something we still do today. Maybe you want to compare it to a car being raffled off. And then the students will think, but what about a human? They're raffling off a human? This person named Sarah, who was 20 years old. She was a house servant. And then they'll see that she's valued at $900. And students will sit back and they'll think, how do you do that? How can you put a value, a price tag on a human being? So all of these little conversations will be sparked from this material. And then one of the other things that they really hit home with this one is that who's listed first? It's the horse, not the human. And that'll really get these students thinking, if this was happening today, a human would be worth less than a car? And that doesn't really seem quite right. So this one piece can spark any number of those conversations. And I'm going to show you just a couple more here. This next one, this is a frustrating one, I will fully admit. This is a slave insurance policy. And it's frustrating because it's an insurance policy. So it's written in legal talk. And I don't know about you, but I do not speak legal. So I just help them dig through this and get to the important words here. So you can see it's number 3670, the slave policy from the American Life Insurance and Trust Company out of Philadelphia. They are insuring the life of George, who was a slave of Joseph Myers, for $1,000. And then we can look at some other things like the conditions here. And these are the conditions that George is gonna have to die so that Joseph Myers gets his money. And that's when the students go, what? What are you talking about? So we take a look at the other side of this piece, and this is the full legal document. And this is where the students really start to talk, because they see that we're paying a $17.40 a month premium for this $1,000 insurance policy. And sometimes students will think, oh, well, his family would get $1,000. They compare it to life insurance today, or they compare it to health insurance today, which is in the news. Students know what that's all about. And they'll think, oh, so he had $1,000 of coverage or something. And I say, no, this isn't a life insurance policy, even though that's what they're calling it. It's a product warranty. And then the students are like, what? And I say, yeah, maybe you've heard about if you crack your cell phone screen in the first month of having it, you can get a brand new cell phone because you've paid, this $10 a month premium for that. Or if you buy a new car and you have this warranty for 5,000 miles or something like that. And so they start to read some of these legal words and they see that that's exactly what this is. That if Joseph and his family here break their slave, George, they get $1,000 back from that investment. So it goes to George. It doesn't go to George's family. It goes to the owner's family. And so just this one thing that you might look at and just kind of toss it to the side, this insurance policy, gets these students really, really going. And I've taught this program not only with, 8th graders and above, I've taught this program with 4th graders, and they ask the exact same questions. So the last two here, having to do with slavery, we have an image here, this sketch of some of the torture devices that would be used with slaves, especially those who had maybe tried to run away or something like that. And sometimes students don't see these things. These are things that aren't typically in a textbook. And if they are, maybe it's just the shackles that they're seeing that would go around someone's wrists. But then they look at this device that would go on their face, and especially the spikes that would go into their neck to kind of keep it in place. And the students get very kind of a visceral reaction to that. But that's what we want. We want them to see this truth, because I'm going to show you some statistics here in just a minute or two about why this really matters. The other primary source I have on the screen there is one of my favorites because they're very accessible, especially with wherever you might be at, and those are local newspapers. So this is from just down the road here in Salem, Ohio. It's a copy of the Anti-Slavery Bugle from, I believe, 1859. And this article is called How to Oppose Slavery with Effect. And I have the students read the first 3 paragraphs, and it talks about how we need to get into these slave states, fight slavery, and that's the only way it's really going to end. And when students read these words, it's the same type of thing that they are experiencing. They're having that curiosity. Who's writing this? What's their audience? What's the purpose of an article like this? And those are questions that spark that curiosity. And then guess what? They learn something. It's not just about a right answer. They are in the process of actually learning something. So, to kind of move away from slavery for a minute, you can do this with almost any type of primary source. So I have 3 pictures here, and I'll kind of give you some examples of how we can do that. So the first picture I'm going to talk about are the 2 little girls with their nanny. This is not from our collection. I found it online, and I think it's really cute. So when we look at a picture like this, we think, oh, cute, okay, and then maybe we move on. But what stories can we dig into with a photograph like this? Well, you can talk about wealth, you can talk about class, you can talk about the fact that this nanny is probably not that much older than the oldest daughter there, the fact that the nanny is most likely raising those children 95% of the time because the rich, wealthy mom is off doing society things. You can talk about where the family got their money. You can talk about, kind of what the life is for that nanny, what her future would be like. So even just this one picture can do so many different things. In the middle there, this is from our collection. This is a medical photograph from Youngstown Sheet and Tube, which was a local steel mill. And you can see he's got some kind of really gross injury on his leg. So we can talk about that. We can talk about safety in a workplace. We can talk about immigrants, because this was an Italian immigrant. We can talk about women in the workplace because we have a female nurse. We can talk about medical history, industrial history, so many different things just on this one photograph. And then the third picture there, this is the Moyers baseball team. And I picked this one because I don't know if you guys have noticed, but A League of Their Own has been on TV like a lot lately, which I'm all about. I love that movie. So I wanted to throw in one of our women's baseball teams. So even just this one photograph can spark those types of conversations. It might not be really hard history. It might be a little bit softer, but we can dig. And we can talk about women's rights, and we can talk about heading into the war and the World War II era. We can talk about workers' rights. We can talk about the fact that this is a women's team with male coaches and so on. So anything can be dug deeper. So that's really, really important. And then I want to get into kind of how we actually do this. So we have our story. We know what we want to say to our students. So how do we actually do this? What are we going to bring into the classroom? Now, I mentioned before that shock value definitely matters, but it's that discussion that you're going to spark that matters way more. And as I said, we never want to use materials simply for that shock value. You don't want to just bring something in that's going to make the students really sit back, unless there's a story behind it. So perhaps it's going to be a photograph in keeping with slavery and maybe the Underground Railroad. You might have a photograph or a sketch of someone being hunted by dogs in the woods. There's some shock value there, but there's a story behind it. Maybe it's a famous photograph of an enslaved person who has been beaten, and you can see the scars in their skin. Maybe you're studying world history and you have a Holocaust picture that you're looking at that is really startling, but there's a story behind it, and those are okay. But to bring in a primary source that just is shock value, that you're not going to put a story behind, like a horrific car accident or something like that, which we have in our collection because we have a lot of insurance records in our collection, and we have some horrific images of accidents and disasters. But if there's no story behind that, if it's not moving a narrative forward, there's no point in bringing it into the classroom. And one of my best pieces of advice is going to be to find that balance, but knowing it's really challenging. You're going to learn to balance that shock value and story as you get more and more experience with students. And the other great thing is that every time you do these types of programs, they're going to be different, because you have different students, you have an entirely different mindset in a classroom, you have a different mindset going into it, so that's never going to be the same. And that's why this is never boring, because it's always different every single time we teach programs like this. So why does it matter? So this is where I want to share with you guys some statistics. So this is coming from a 2018 report that the Southern Poverty Law Center put together, particularly having to do with slavery education. So I'm going to read to you some of the stats that they found. So they found that only 8% of high school seniors can identify slavery as a central cause of the Civil War. So 8%, that's it. 2/3 of high school seniors don't know that it took a constitutional amendment to formally end slavery. So 68% of high school seniors don't know that it took a constitutional amendment to end slavery. And then 22% can identify how provisions in the Constitution gave advantages to slaveholders. So only 22% of our seniors can see how the United States Constitution benefited slave owners and slaveholders. So research like that should probably make you a little upset, a little nervous. And to dig even deeper about why does this matter, think about what's happening in our world right now. You know, the issue of race is at the forefront of the world that we are living in. And we want to make sure students know the depth of where that's coming from. This isn't a new conversation. It's not a unique conversation. It's something we've been talking about for years and for centuries. So a few more statistics here. Teachers, about 90% of the teachers they surveyed said that they felt comfortable discussing slavery in the classroom, but that their responses to open-ended questions revealed that they had profound unease about the topic. And 58% of teachers found that their textbooks were very inadequate in teaching about slavery. And if you have a minute, research history textbooks, because you will be shocked at how different they can be. The same textbook by the same publisher in California is going to tell a completely different story than that textbook will in Texas. Completely different. And unfortunately, that's the world that we live in. And 40% of teachers believe that their state offered inefficient support for teaching about slavery. So teachers want to do this. They don't have the support behind them coming from the state. And I'm going to kind of keep going here with what this survey concluded. And that is there were 7 things that they decided were things that needed to be changed with slavery education. And I have the text here on the screen. I know I hate putting text on a screen, but in case we share these slides with you, I wanted you to have this text. So we teach slavery without context, preferring to present the good news before the bad. And in elementary school, here's that example. Students learn about the Underground Railroad, about Harriet Tubman, or other feel-good stories, often before they even learn about slavery. How can we do that? How can an elementary student learn about the Underground Railroad and Harriet Tubman, and they call her the, Moses because she's freeing her people, and they don't even know what slavery is because they haven't been introduced to it? So it's this happy, feel-good story. And then in high school, we focus on Frederick Douglass and abolition and emancipation without ever understanding how slave labor built the nation. So even in that, it's kind of a happy story. So we really need to help these students see the hard history behind this. And that's our job as historians, is to give these students this opportunity. And hard history is hard for a reason. We've got to help these students dig and dig and dig and dig and dig and dig to realize where things are coming from. And as I said at the beginning, if they're living in this world today, they can handle it. They can do it. They see the headlines that are happening all around them. They experience bullying. They experience active shooter drills. They're seeing these types of things, so they can handle it. And it's just up to us to make it appropriate and make it safe for them. So I want to mention just one more thing, because this was kind of shocking. This doesn't have anything to do with slavery. It has to do with Holocaust education. So as I was researching this, that also was coming up, because there are only about 13, I believe it's currently 13 states that have mandated Holocaust education in their state curriculum standards. That's it. And Ohio is one of them that does not have mandated Holocaust education. So we're really, I think, I'm gonna say it, we're really failing our students when it comes to understanding history worldwide and putting our modern day world into any kind of context for them to understand. All right, so now let's get into what are we actually gonna do when we're in the classroom. So make sure your teachers know what types of materials you're going to use. You can send information out to your teachers ahead of time. You can, kind of make sure your marketing and communication materials mention primary sources, letting the teachers know these are going to be hard topics. We're going to talk about hard history, not soft history this time. Because the teacher might want to share that with the students' adults. And we know we're not bringing anything in that's going to be inappropriate to their age level, but we still might want to communicate that with the students' adults. And then how do we create, I loved this little Wordle I found online. So how are we going to create a safe and inclusive classroom for these students? So I've got a couple tips for you here. So number one, set the stage. Students need to know that these primary resources they're looking at are real, that these students are looking and learning about real people and real events that actually happened. Let them know that they are not just papers. These are stories. These are things that actually happened. Set the groundwork for respect for the material, and students will follow along. If you treat the topic with respect, so will they. And then probably the biggest thing personally is to know yourself, to know your own biases as you head into that classroom, and be able to kind of check some of that at the door, because we never want to bring our biases in. It's incredibly challenging not to do that, but and more practice, you start to kind of overcome that as a teacher. And that's what we want to help these students do as well, is to try to overcome some of these natural built-in biases that we've either learned from a very young age or we've picked up as we've gotten older. So know those when you're heading into any type of program. Try to recognize the makeup of a classroom. You never want to make assumptions about who you're looking at, but just try to, see the ages of the classroom, and just try to get an idea of who you're going to be working with in that classroom. And then be active in your facilitation, knowing that you want to help lead the students, but you also want the students to help lead you. It's going to be a big give and take to see to what depth they're comfortable going and to what depth you're comfortable going. Making sure that they are comfortable leading the conversation. Of course, keeping everyone respectful. You know, there are going to be comments that maybe aren't very nice. Sometimes when I'm teaching that raffle poster and they see that Sarah was worth, I think it's $900, and some of them will think, oh, well, I'm worth 1,000, you know, and they want to kind of have that joke. Well, that joke is coming from a place of being uncomfortable. And they want to make a joke because it makes it lighter. And so kind of be ready for that we might get some of those types of comments. And sometimes, you know, depending on the mood of the classroom, you can kind of run with it and say, okay, well, why do you think you're worth $1 million? Why aren't you worth $2 million? Or maybe if the mood isn't quite there, you just move on. Something else to be ready for is the emotions. Be ready to face sadness and anger and uncertainty and questioning. Also be ready for indifference. If you are teaching a 9th grade class at 8 o'clock in the morning, they might not be with you all the way. So be ready for that. That's going to happen no matter what you're teaching. And I'm going to just really quick mention deniers. So I've not really had this happen, but I have heard about it from other colleagues who are teaching some type of hard history, and they will have a student just flat out deny it. Whether it's, you know, oh, the Holocaust never happened, or whether a student is saying slavery wasn't that bad, they had food and clothing and a house to live in. So how do we deal with that? How do we deal with these deniers? Sometimes your best bet is to let them talk and then move on. Don't even address it. Sometimes you do want to address it. Maybe you want to ask the teacher, you know, is this kind of a common comeback that that student would have? Maybe you address them one-on-one, some type of situation like that. Hopefully it's not going to happen too often, but I think it might be becoming a little bit more common, unfortunately, in the world that we're living in right now. So my last screen here are just some resources that I can send out to all of you guys. The Southern Poverty Law Center, I absolutely love their resources for teaching hard history. I took a lot of the statistics from that. And then they partnered with Teaching Tolerance. So tolerance.org is another really, really wonderful resource for getting tips for how to teach this hard, heavy stuff. And then if you're just looking for some primary sources for how to bring those into a classroom or how to incorporate them into your curriculum programming, Library of Congress and the National Archives have wonderful resources for teachers, for historians, for anyone who really want to dive into these types of primary sources. So I'm going to leave you guys. Hopefully we have a little bit of time for some questions here. I'm going to leave you guys with just a little bit of inspiration that it can be scary to do this type of programming. The first time you do it, you might realize, well, everything I just did, I'm never going to do again. And you start from scratch. That's the nice thing about this is we have the opportunities to always keep learning and making sure that those students we're working with are not only being inspired, but inspiring us to keep bringing them the truth when it comes to history. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Natalie and see if we have any questions or comments and try to get you guys involved.
Yeah, Tracy, we do have one question in the comments
Okay.
right now, wanting to know if you've ever had any pushback or complaints from parents.
From parents, no, I've never had any pushback from parents. The only pushback I've really ever had was from a teacher. The teacher was from a religious school, and she was kind of concerned about a Native American program and talking about indigenous people that lived here thousands and thousands of years ago, because the particular religious school did not believe that, did not believe that kind of depth of humanity in the time frame. So I just kind of had to alter a little bit and talk about more recent Native Americans and not go back to thousands and thousands of years ago. And at that moment, I just kind of said, okay, I will adapt to what you want to do in your classroom. I'm still going to tell the truth. I'm still going to teach this program about Indigenous people. I'm just going to start it a little bit later in time.
We have a question about where this recording is going to be available. I believe they'll be on the Ohio Local History Alliance or YouTube, and I think one other place, and they'll be available. And everything that you click on here, I think that you'll eventually be able to click on other sessions that you may have missed and download them. Another question: any experience or advice working with a mix of age ranges and education level?
When you're working with a mixed group, that's going to be a challenge. What you might want to do is then separate these students into smaller groups that are more with their age levels. Because there's a lot of cognitive development behind, what's age appropriate, what's in curriculum standards, and so on. And we want to make sure that we're not, forcing students to do things that are really beyond their cognitive abilities. So if you've got an eighth grader and a third grader in the same setting, you might want to separate them a little bit. If you don't have that opportunity, have them work together. Have your older students work with your younger students, and then you can kind of have those two age groups inspire each other. If you've got huge gaps in age or grade levels, that might get a little more challenging. So it's kind of best to either separate them or let the older students help the younger ones. That would be my advice for that.
We have a question from Sherry. Do you let the schools come to you, or do you recommend reaching out? How should you approach a school?
So we go to the schools with our marketing materials. We have a really heavy list of curriculum programs that we take out to our local schools. So when we were kind of starting that, it's the big process of heading to every school district's website that you would work with, getting as many emails as you can, doing a mass email blast out to people, letting them know what you can offer to the classroom, following up, making phone calls. If you have like an educational resource center in your county or your district, maybe you reach out to the social studies curriculum person and let them know what you have to offer. You reach out to a principal or a superintendent. That's kind of the best way to really get the schools, I should say, to know what you have to offer. Getting into schools can be challenging if it's something you've never done before as an organization, but most schools are used to it. A lot of schools will have lots of outreach that come in, whether it's the United Way or it's a science program or whatever is coming into their school. So most schools are more and more comfortable with bringing outreach into their classrooms. In today's world, this is what it's going to be like. It's going to be doing a lot of virtual presentations, which can be challenging when you're working with three-dimensional objects like artifacts. But this type of program, like this, the Underground Railroad program I teach, can be adapted to do in this type of way. So that would hopefully answer that question.
I have a question related to that. I was going to ask what you're doing now. Have you worked on adapting anything now, or been approached by schools, or tried approaching schools, or what's going on now?
Yeah, so we have been approached by several schools, and this is exactly what we're doing. So I'm planning to do some kind of Zoom classes with a few of my 8th grade classes that I kind of typically teach in every year. It's going to be very much like this. I'm going to share primary sources on the screen. I'm also going to email the teacher PDF copies, so she has paper copies for the students to look at, and then try to lead a discussion just like this. Some of our other programs that are artifact based are a little bit more challenging. So we're still trying to work that out and how we can share kind of artifacts in a virtual way, knowing the students can't touch them, they can't handle them, anything like that. But yeah, you just try to make do with what you have. And even if it's just sending copies with some written curriculum to a teacher in a big PDF package, that's still better than nothing. You know, even if you don't have a setup to be able to do this type of presentation, anything you can do to really bring that history to the teachers, I'm sure they're going to appreciate.
Traci, would you be willing to share some of like links to, do you have this stuff on the Mahoning Valley Historical Society website where people can
Yes.
see what's offered? So people, to share, to see how you've set up what you have
Yeah, so
available.
I can, let me type some stuff in here. So our website is sorry, my laptop's like way up high to get the camera at the right height. So mahoninghistory.org is our website. And right there at the top of the screen, you're gonna see a Learn tab, and then all of our educational offerings are under that. My contact information will be there. So any questions you have, if you want to talk, you know, kind of one-on-one about maybe something you're thinking about that you want to do with the classroom, I am more than happy to have that conversation and hopefully kind of help anyone out there who wants to start getting out in the classroom.
Does anybody out there have any other questions? You can ask to unmute, or you can type them in the Q&A. Otherwise, Traci, I want to thank you for sharing your experiences with this programming. And oh, looks like we might. Oh wait, we do have one from Kristen. Have you delivered slavery programs to diverse groups of students, and what was your experience? I'm thinking about what the experience would be for a white student versus Black students, and if some language or terms could be potentially triggering for Black students.
That is a awesome question. So yes, I've delivered these programs to any type of student, whether it's an inner city school, a suburban school, a rural school, parochial schools, you name it. So I think when we're approaching a mixed audience, or we're approaching a predominantly, you know, classroom that's people of color, you want to make sure that you're giving them a safe space to talk about this, and that you're also telling them from the start, I'm distressed by this. This is history that I'm not proud of. It's history that is important, but we really need to talk about it. And I will have students that will just kind of shut down. They don't want to talk about things. And then I have other students that get almost like they're empowered by it. You know, they see this history, they know what it's done to people of color, and then they get inspired and they get very proud of how far we've come, knowing we still have a crazy distance to go. But I think it's just about making sure those students know that they have a space that they can share their feelings, they can share their thoughts. When I'm teaching this program with, say, an all-white classroom, especially if I'm in kind of a very rural setting, sometimes I do get those deniers who say, you know, slavery wasn't that bad, it's no big deal. And then I just show them these primary sources again. And I'm like, if it wasn't that bad, why did this happen? You know? So I think you kind of get more and more experience, and you get more comfortable with teaching different types of people. I will share one story. When I was working outside Washington, D.C., we were doing a really interesting program with inner city Latinx community. And they would come to Harpers Ferry Park, which is kind of way out in the country. And we were teaching programs about John Brown, about the abolitionist movement, and then a program called Black Voices, where we talked about that same time period from the perspective of the African American community. And I did have a student say to me, what's a white chick gonna tell me about history, about this history? And I just kind of said, you know what, let's see what I can tell you. And then I want you to share your experiences with me too. So making sure it's always a two-way door, that the student can share, that you can share. If things are triggering to students, I think that's when, if a student wants to leave the classroom, you know, if they're getting emotional, they're getting kind of physically upset, let them leave, let them walk away. Maybe you want to talk to them afterwards. But just making sure it's a two-way street, that it's a respectful two-way street, knowing that we all come from a place of some type of bias, and how can we step back from our own bias and give the students the stage to learn this stuff. So I hope that answers your question. It's a tough topic to really try to give an answer to, but it's just kind of about making sure it's a safe space for the student to feel comfortable expressing their opinions and their feelings.
Well, great. Traci, I want to thank you again for talking to us, and I hope everybody's having a good first day of the conference. We've got 2 more to go, and there's one more session today that's just one session for the entire time frame from 4:30 to 5:30, and it's should be a very good open discussion with attendees about relevance in a world with bigger problems. That'll be led by Greg Palumbo and Terry Puckett, so that should be a really great opportunity for us to discuss some of the challenges and new challenges that we're all facing today. So thank you again, and thanks everybody for coming, and have a great afternoon.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Okay, let's see here. I don't think I need to turn the recording off. I'm just, well, there, I'll stop it now.